And here we go. This is my rack, which actually houses most of the recent additions to my studio gear. Starting from top to bottom, up at the top we've got the PB 4x4 Pro, which is my power conditioner, power distributor. Almost everything in the studio connects to that, which connects of course to my main house power, and that gives me a single path to ground for all of my gear, which helps to avoid ground loops and noise and that are caused by things like that. Just down below that we have the only piece of Behringer gear I have in my studio, which is my ADA 8000 from Behringer, and that's basically 8 channels of ADDA conversion over optical, over ADAT, which connects to my Steinberg MR816 audio interface. This is my main FireWire audio interface into and out of the computer. This thing integrates beautifully with Cubase, which, as you saw on the screen earlier, is my main DAW of choice. Has a lot of cool features. Check that out online if you're curious about that. But between these two devices here, I get 16 inputs and outputs in and out of the computer over FireWire. So that's pretty good. What I do is I use the 8 outputs from the Behringer, which feed my PM8, which I'll talk about in a second, and then the main outputs from the Steinberg feed my monitors and my headphone distributor, which is right below. That leads us, perfect segue right into that. That's the Apex AHA61, which is a 6-channel headphone amp. Gives me an opportunity to get up to 6 people a pair of headphones to monitor what's happening in the studio for the odd occasion when I do end up recording artists, which does happen from time to time, although I mainly mix. And just below that we have a pair of the Golden Age Audio Pre-73 mic preamp / DIs. These things are absolutely fantastic. They're sort of a Neve clone, a knockoff of the 1073, which would cost a heck of a lot more if it said Neve on the faceplate. But these things get remarkably close. Basically, they have an input transformer gain stage and an output transformer gain stage, which is great because I can dial up the input transformer really hot if I want to get a lot of color and grit and just turn back the output a little, or vice versa if I want a cleaner signal. There's an impedance button which switches from low to high impedance, which will drastically change the sound of an input signal plugged into it as well. These serve 48-volt phantom power, and they function as a DI as well with a 1/4-inch input on the front side. So I've got a pair of these that are, and a little rack kit that allows me to mount them in my rack, and they do a fantastic job. So definitely have a look at those. And moving right along, from SM Pro Audio, we've got the PM8, which is a passive summing mixer. Basically what this thing does is it takes 8 analog signals out of the computer, and it sums them together in the analog domain to stereo. It works completely passively. You have an active option as well, but it's kind of low quality component, so I choose not to use the active side of things. It's very hard to screw up a passive signal path, and so I use it passively. The trick is that when you sum passively, you lose a lot of, about 20 dB or so, 20-25 dB of gain, so that gain needs to be brought back up in order to be captured back into the computer, and I'll explain that flow in a minute. Just below that I have my M-Patch 2, also from SM Pro Audio, and this thing acts as basically my main volume knob. Any audio coming out of my computer, hitting my speakers, passes through this first, and so I have a volume attenuator, nice big solid knob that gives me control over how loud my speakers are. This thing also has opportunity for a secondary auxiliary input, so I can plug in, an iPod or CD player or anything else that I want to run through my system. And this is how I choose between my inputs here. And it also supports up to 2 output pairs. And so my main Tapco S5 monitor setup is on monitor 1, on output 1, and then my lo-fi little tiny speakers here on monitor 2, and so I can very quickly and easily switch between them, turn them both off if I just want to listen through headphones and no speakers. I can have them both on, which I'm not totally sure why I would want to do that, but the option is there. But in most cases it's set up like this. There's a mute switch for very quick, easy kill the speakers. There's a stereo mono switch, so I can really quickly flick and hear anything that's coming through my system in mono if I need to check that, which sometimes you do. And also you have a volume control for the headphone amp. This unit is completely passive as well. If you're not going to use the headphone amp, you don't even need to plug this thing into power. The power is only for the headphone amp and the lights. Otherwise, this thing will function totally perfectly, completely passively. And just below that, I have my Aphex Aural Exciter. This thing was a steal of a deal. I found it used in the rental department at the Long and McQuaid music store that I work out of. I think I brought this home for about $29, and it does a wonderful job of adding a little harmonic excitation and some low-end enhancement to my mixes. Below that, I have my MPX 100 Lexicon Effects unit, which gives me, reverbs, choruses, delays, things of that nature. And below that, I have my little Alesis 3630 compressor. I've seen one of these in pretty much every little home studio I've ever been in. They're dirt cheap and they do the job. There's nothing fancy about them whatsoever, but they give you dynamics controls, gate, and compression. And I don't use it very often, but every now and again it comes into play. And below that, I have my Fostex patch bay. And this, all the insert points and the outputs that I need out of my DAW, out of my interface, they show up on this side of the patch bay, and all the gear in my rack shows up on this side of the patch bay, and it's very easy for me to patch in anything that I want to run my signal through. So that's what I got going on there. And just below that, you can't really see it in the dark, but is my Uniter 8, which is old school technology. Some of you guys may remember this, but it's an 8-in, 8-out MIDI interface over USB. So I've got 8 MIDI channels in and 8 MIDI channels out. Excuse me, 8 MIDI ports in and ports out. Each port can contain 16 channels. So everything that has to do with MIDI, the modules from my drum kit, and my FATAR controller, pretty much everything that's not connected directly by USB that serves MIDI data is connecting to the computer through the Uniter 8. And that is pretty much my rack. So I just wanted to briefly explain to you the back end of my system and how I use this PM8 passive mixer along with my Golden Age pre's and some of the other gear here to run my mixes through. So basically what happens is I in my DAW, and don't know if you can see here, perhaps I can get some of this stuff out of the way. Right here, you can see over on this side that I have my main stereo outputs direct to my speakers, and I also have 4 what I call stems, stem 1 through 4 as outputs. So what I'll do is I'll take everything in my mix. So my bass, for example, is going to out to stem 1. If you look at my keys, they're going out to stem 2. If you look at my my drums, they're going out to stem 3. Let me just get rid of that. Okay, because I didn't really want that in group edit mode, but that's okay. So those guys are going out to stem 3, and all my effects are going out to stem 4. So those are discrete outputs out of my interface, and those outputs are connected to the inputs of this PM8 passive mixer. Okay, so my bass would show up on inputs 1 and 2, panned hard left and right, gain at max, and I have a mute control if I want to mute them really quickly. And then my bass would show up here, and my keys would show up here in this particular mix, and all of my effects would show up here. So they're summed together in the analog domain. There's a main volume attenuator here, completely passive as I mentioned before. So because it's passive, I lose a bunch of gain. So the output of this mixer, the output after this pot right here, feeds my Golden Age pre's. So now my entire mix is running through the Golden Age pre-73s, and I think of this as sort of the poor man's Neve console to mix through. And so I dial in the appropriate amount of color and gain that I need to get a decent level going back into the computer, and then the output of those pre's come back in to my interface on channels 1 and 2. And I set up an audio track in the system to record the result, to print the mix, basically. And now these 2 inputs on the back of the Steinberg, which you can't see from here, have insert points. And those insert points, of course, show up on my patch bay. There's the insert points there. Now these insert points right now are feeding my Aural Exciter, the Aphex Aural Exciter. So now my entire mix is going out of my 4 discrete stereo outputs, sorry to make you dizzy there, into my passive summing mixer to be combined in the analog domain. The output of that is then being brought back up in volume by my pre-73s, adjusted to taste, input and output side, left and right here. The output of that is being sent back into my DAW to be recorded as the print. And just before it hits the DAW, there are insert points on the back that allow me to insert any of the gear that's in my rack or anything that I might acquire. And in this particular instance, I'm running through the Aphex Aural Exciter to get a little harmonic excitation happening on the upper and the lower end of the mix before it gets back into the computer and recorded onto the return track. And that's pretty much how I would describe the back end of my particular system. And this is something that I've been experimenting with for just a few months, and I'm really happy with the results. And hopefully maybe you guys get some ideas out of that setup and can try a few of these things out yourself. And if you have any kind of repetitive stress injuries from your hand being on a mouse for ages, get a trackpad if you're a Mac user. These things are awesome. You can combine that with a little software application called Better Touch Tool, and it will actually allow you to program your own custom multi-touch gestures. So you can have, for example, a 4-finger tap will close a window that's open, or 4-finger swipe will do something, or a 2-finger tap, or whatever. You can customize it any way you see fit, which is very cool. And that is the poorly lit tour of my little home studio. And there's my first guitar I ever owned right there, my Fender Prodigy. They don't make those anymore, but it's a nice little sort of Strat style guitar. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And check out TechMuze.ca if you're interested in what I have to say, which you may or may not be. It's difficult to say. TechMuze.ca, you'll see show notes and hear episodes there, and subscribe in iTunes if you like what you hear. Alright guys, I hope you like what you saw, and like I said, stop by www.techmuse.ca and check out the show and leave some comments, get some conversation happening, and we'll take it from there. Take care.